Hey, have you ever heard a story that just makes you pause and think, wait, what just happened?
Oh, definitely.
That was kind of my first reaction when I read about Kilmar Abrego Garcia. He's a Maryland man, and he was deported to El Salvador.
Okay, well, deportation itself isn't unheard of, obviously.
Right, but here's the part that really makes you look twice.
Right.
There was actually a court order already in place, an order saying he couldn't be deported there, to El Salvador specifically.
Okay. Yeah, that's different. That's definitely worth digging into.
Exactly. So today, let's dive deep into this. We're basing this on an ABC News article that lays out the facts pretty clearly.
Sounds good. It seems like a situation with a lot of layers. We should probably try to trace the timeline, figure out the legal arguments flying back and forth, especially about that court order.
Yeah, and look at how the Trump administration and the government in El Salvador are involved.
And why it seems like everything's just stuck right now. Basically, help listeners get the key details and understand why this case is kind of a big deal.
Okay, so let's start with the core issue, the unbelievable part, really. The deportation itself.
Right.
So Kilmar Abrego Garcia, he originally came here fleeing political violence back in 2011.
Okay, so he's been here a while.
Yeah, and then, boom, March 15th of this year, he gets deported.
That recent.
Wow. Very recent. But the kicker, like we said, is that court order from 2019. It specifically barred his deportation to El Salvador.
That's the crux of it, isn't it? A direct court order, seemingly, well, not followed. It immediately raises questions about process, about checks and balances. How does that happen?
You have to wonder. Now, adding to the complexity, you've got the Trump administration's reason, or their stated reason.
Okay, what's their side?
They claim Abrego Garcia is a member of the MS-13 gang.
MS-13. That's obviously a very serious allegation in any immigration context.
Extremely serious. But, and this is a really important but, from the article, his lawyers are saying the administration hasn't actually presented much evidence of this in court. Like, little evidence is the phrase used.
And that's crucial. In a legal setting, an accusation, especially one that's serious, needs backing. If the evidence hasn't been presented convincingly in court, it does make you question the foundation for holding him, and certainly for deporting him against an order.
Definitely raises questions. And then think about where he is now. He's being held in El Salvador, in a place called C.E. Cott Prison. The article calls it notorious.
Notorious prison. That doesn't sound good at all. It adds another layer of concern for his safety and well-being.
It really does. And here's a detail that just, well, it kind of floored me a bit. The U.S. government, under the Trump administration, is apparently paying El Salvador $6 million.
Paying them? For what?
To house deported migrants, including Abrego Garcia.
Wait, so the U.S. is paying El Salvador to keep him in this notorious prison, even though a U.S. court said he shouldn't have been deported there in the first place?
That's what the article states.
Yeah. That adds a really strange financial dimension. It suggests cooperation, an agreement, but it feels deeply contradictory given the court order. Are we funding his detention while simultaneously having a legal obligation that seems to put the other way? What kind of leverage does that even give us?
Right. It feels like pulling in opposite directions. Now, the article mentions a meeting, Oval Office. President Trump and the president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele.
Okay, high-level meeting. You'd think that would be a chance to sort this specific issue out.
You would think. But apparently, President Bukele stated quite clearly he would not return Abrego Garcia.
He just said no. Flat out.
Seems like it. And then after that, Attorney General Pam Bondi basically said, well, getting him back is up to El Salvador, kind of washing their hands of it, maybe?
Implying the U.S. side is done or can't do more?
But then President Bukele apparently responded saying he doesn't actually have the power to just unilaterally send someone back to the U.S. like that.
Oh, so it's a case of he said, everyone points fingers?
Yeah. Exactly. His lawyer, Abrego Garcia's lawyer, used that Spider-Man meme analogy. You know the one. All the Spider-Mans pointing at each other.
Yeah, I know it. That's actually depressingly accurate for picturing bureaucratic deadlock.
Yeah.
Nobody taking responsibility.
It really paints a picture of this political and bureaucratic maze he's caught in, while his actual situation is, pretty serious.
That analogy really cuts through the complexity to the core problem. Diffuse responsibility. The focus shifts from the original issue, the potentially wrongful deportation, to this international finger-pointing.
So, stuck in this stalemate, his lawyers had to go back to the courts here. They filed a motion.
Okay, what's the argument now?
They're arguing the Trump administration hasn't done anything concrete to facilitate his release, even though there are court orders saying they should. And this word, facilitate, seems to be the new legal battleground.
Ah, the meaning of a single word. Happens all the time in law. So what's the fight over facilitate?
Well, the administration seems to think facilitate just means removing roadblocks on the U.S. side, like domestic paperwork or legal hurdles. Once he's out of the country, their job to facilitate is, in their view, basically done.
A very narrow interpretation, it sounds like. Just clearing the path domestically, not actively helping him return from abroad.
Exactly. But his lawyers argue that interpretation makes the court order almost useless. Like, what's the point then? They say facilitate has to mean, at a bare minimum, the U.S. government should formally ask El Salvador to release him.
Make an actual request, which sounds reasonable if the goal is to comply with the spirit of the order.
And according to the article, the administration hasn't even done that simple step. They haven't officially requested his release.
Wow. Okay, so where does the Supreme Court fit into this? Did they weigh in?
They did. They looked at it. They actually upheld the lower court's order telling the administration to facilitate his release and, importantly, to make sure his underlying immigration case could proceed as if he'd never been wrongly deported.
Okay, so they backed the facilitate part.
Yes, but they did question another word that was in the original district court order. Effectuate.
Facilitate and effectuate. What's the difference they saw? Well, the Supreme Court seemed worried that telling the government to effectuate his return, essentially meaning make it happen, ensure it happens, might be overstepping. Like the court's telling the executive branch how to deal with another sovereign country, El Salvador. That gets tricky.
Right, separation of powers, foreign relations.
Exactly. So Judge Schuentes, the district judge, had initially ordered the government to both facilitate and effectuate.
But after the Supreme Court's input,
she amended the order, took out effectuate. So now it just says facilitate.
Which brings us right back to the core question. What does facilitate actually require the administration to do? Is it just passive paper pushing here or active engagement abroad?
That's the multi-million-dollar question, legally speaking. The administration takes the limited view, the lawyers demand more action. It really highlights that tension between courts protecting rights and the executive handling foreign affairs.
The article mentions his lawyer was hopeful about a hearing scheduled for a Tuesday, hoping it would, quote, light a fire under the government.
Push them to actually do something based on that facilitate order.
Yeah. And interestingly, the lawyer mentioned he's actually worked with DHS before on similar cases.
Oh, really?
Yeah, helping other clients who were wrongly deported, who won their cases, to actually get back to the U.S.
That's really significant. It shows there's precedent. It's possible for DHS to work to bring someone back in these situations.
Right. It suggests it's not impossible, maybe just not happening in this specific case for some reason. Makes you wonder why this one's different.
It certainly implies that the mechanism exists or has existed in the past. It adds weight to the argument that facilitate should mean more than just sitting back.
And this whole situation led the lawyer to raise some, pretty fundamental concerns, talking about the rule of law, the Constitution, due process.
As you'd expect. Because if court orders, especially ones reviewed by the Supreme Court, can just be sidelined or interpreted so narrowly they lose their teeth, what does that mean for the legal system itself?
It feels bigger than just one case, right? It touches on how our whole system of checks and balances is supposed to function.
Precisely. It risks creating a scenario where the executive might seem to be operating without sufficient regard for judicial rulings, and that's a serious concern in any democracy.
The lawyer also made a very practical point, almost a strategic one, about leverage.
Leverage, how so?
Remember that $6 million payment?
Yeah.
The lawyer basically said, look, the U.S. is renting space in El Salvador's prison. We're paying them.
Sure.
So maybe, he suggested, just maybe, stopping those payments could be a way to encourage El Salvador to cooperate, to return Abrego Garcia.
The power of the purse. Using financial leverage, that's a very direct approach to facilitating his return, isn't it?
Seems pretty direct, yeah.
It certainly puts a spotlight on the potential tools the U.S. could use if the will was there. It makes you ask, if that leverage exists, why isn't it being considered or used? Especially if the aim is to comply with a court order. Are there other diplomatic considerations we don't know about?
Good question. So let's just quickly put it all in a nutshell. We have Kilmar Abrego Garcia deported to El Salvador despite a court order saying no.
Yeah.
He's held in a prison described as notorious.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. government under the Trump administration accused him of being MS-13, but apparently showed little court evidence, and they're paying El Salvador to detain him.
Right. The payment part is still baffling.
Then you have the blame game. El Salvador says they won't send him back or can't. The U.S. says it's up to them.
The Spider-Man meme situation.
Exactly. And legally, it all hinges now on what facilitate means and requires the U.S. government to actually do. It's quite a tangle.
It really is a tangle.
Yeah.
This case is like a lens, focusing on the really complex points where immigration law, international diplomacy, and the raw power of court orders meet or sometimes collide.
And it forces you to think about the real person stuck in the middle of all this legal and political maneuvering.
Absolutely. The human impact.
And yeah, what does facilitate mean when someone's freedom is on the line and multiple governments are involved? Does it mean just shuffling papers here, or does it demand reaching across borders to fix a potential wrong?
It's a fundamental question about responsibility and the reach of justice.
Definitely makes you think about the human consequences of these policies and legal interpretations and just how vital due process is supposed to be. It's clearly an ongoing situation, too.
Something to keep watching, for sure. And it prompts that broader thought. How do we ensure accountability when legal orders get caught in the gears of international relations? A tough question with no easy answers.